Welcome to Thread of Terror. We bring you the creepiest stories from Reddit. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and hit subscribe so you never miss a scare. People of Reddit that believe in the paranormal. What exactly happened to make you start believing? Story 1. Girl in the Copse.
This happened when I was 6 years old, and I am nearly 50 now, so my memory is a little hazy. I had a friend my age named Kelly. We often played together with other children in our block and nearby areas. One afternoon, Kelly knocked on my door. I answered, and she asked if I could go to the corner shop with her to buy bananas so we could make milkshakes. Before I could reply, my stepmother called down the stairs, insisting I clean my room and forbidding me from going out. Kelly shrugged and said she would go on her own. That was the last time I saw her. By early evening, her mother was knocking on doors, searching for her. The fathers in the neighborhood gathered to help look for Kelly. It grew later, and when I went to bed, she still had not been found. In the early hours of the morning, I woke to an odd noise outside my bedroom window. A soft, intermittent moaning. Peering out, I saw a policeman sitting on the wall, sobbing as another officer comforted him. Uneasy, I went downstairs, where my father told me Kelly had been found dead in the wooded copse near our block. I later learned that Kelly had been murdered by one of the older boys who used to hang out with us. When I gave my statement, I told the police I had seen Kelly the previous afternoon, but they revealed Kelly had been killed hours before she knocked on my door. The shopkeeper also confirmed she never came in to buy bananas. From that day on, I believe Kelly returned for one last visit before she departed forever. The paranormal has seemed normal to me ever since.
Story 2. Haunted Basement.
Where my house is located, there used to be another house. It burned down, and the father of the family who lived there died in the basement during the fire. The family sold the land, and the house was cleared away, with a new house being built over the old basement. My grandmother, who lives in the same town, knew the family. Anyways, my parents bought the new house when I was a toddler, and we have lived there for about 20 years. The ghost of the man who died in the fire, named Charlie, resides in our house, and it's pretty obvious. My mom says that once when she and my dad were arguing, she went to the bedroom to cool off. She said, "Charlie, I wish you could knock some sense into him." Not 5 minutes later, my dad starts swearing from the living room. The shelves above his chair had fallen and knocked him on the head. They've never fallen before or since. Any animal we've had, a couple of dogs when I was a kid, and my cat now will stare down the hallway for long stretches of time, then go wild, chasing something from the living room at one end to the bedrooms at the other, as if they're playing with someone. Personally, I have heard footsteps, big, heavy footsteps, like someone wearing work boots, walk up and down the hallway, especially at night. It scared me as a child, but now I just take it as Charlie checking on our safety. My grandmother, while visiting us one time, woke up in the guest bedroom to a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. She hid under the blanket for a few minutes, then decided it was safe. When she came out from under the blanket, the shadowy figure was at her bedside, leaning over her. She hid under the blanket again until she fell asleep. The most concrete evidence for me was the time Charlie scared something off. My bedroom was always the coldest room in the house, and I often felt uncomfortable in there, like I was sitting next to someone who disliked me. One day I went to grab clothes for a shower and walked right into a wall of malevolence halfway down the hall. I can't describe it fully, nothing looked different. I just felt like I had physically crossed a barrier into a force field of hatred. I knew without a doubt in my body that I was in danger, and without thinking, I ran to the opposite end of the house to the kitchen. I stood at the stove shaking. I was about 14, afraid to look down the hallway in case I saw whatever was there, but also afraid that if I didn't look, it would sneak up on me. I eventually convinced myself that I was being overdramatic and started slowly through the dining room toward the hall, afraid the entire time. All at once, I felt a strong breeze blow by my left side, going down the hall toward my room. Like how it feels when someone runs by you and barely avoids running into you. For a second, I thought I heard a man's voice. I continued down the hall, and I couldn't feel the malevolent presence anymore. I went into my room, and it felt lighter and more comfortable than it ever had in my life. I thanked Charlie, and from then on, I've never felt that uncomfortable feeling in my room. I think he protects it now. But yeah, growing up in a haunted house is pretty convincing in my opinion.
Story 3. Conversations with the Dead.
When I was a child, I had an imaginary friend named Mr. Johnson. I would spend hours talking to and playing with him, and my parents didn't think much of it at first. They assumed it was harmless childhood imagination. But one day while my mum was out watering the yard, a neighbor walked by and struck up a conversation with her. He mentioned that he was surprised she had moved into that house as it was rumored to be haunted. He went on to say that the previous tenant had died there, and his name was Mr. Johnson. After that conversation, my parents became noticeably uncomfortable whenever I spoke about my imaginary friend. I could feel the tension building, and eventually, I stopped talking to Mr. Johnson altogether. But something strange had already begun to happen. I have a vivid memory from that time, one that still chills me to this day. I remember talking to something that was perched on the curtain rod in the same house. I can't recall the conversation, but I remember that its voice was raspy and unnatural, sending an uncomfortable shiver down my spine. My dad walked in, clearly confused and concerned. He asked what I was doing, and at that moment the voice from the curtain rod told me to say, "I'm God." Without thinking, I blurted out that I was talking to God. The look on my dad's face was pure horror. I had no idea why my simple statement had such an effect, nor did I understand the significance of what I had just said. But when I saw how terrified my dad looked, it sent a cold wave through me, and the memory has stayed with me ever since. There was something about that house, something dark and unsettling. I had no way of knowing it then, but I think Mr. Johnson, or whatever it was, never really left.
Story 4. Child's creepy companion.
I once got hired to install a security system in an old house. The family that had just moved in had a little boy, around 5 years old. He was playful and seemed to enjoy entertaining himself around the house, often asking me random questions. At first I thought it was innocent, but things soon took a strange turn. One day, after I answered one of his questions, he looked at me and said, "Oh, sorry, I was just talking to my friend." I chuckled, thinking it was just a child's imagination at work. But then, The mother popped her head in and casually mentioned that her son had made a new friend since they'd moved in. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper, and added, "It's actually kind of creepy." I remember her nervous laugh, but I didn't give it much thought. Later that afternoon, I was working in the living room, running some cables through the walls. The boy had wandered into the kitchen and started climbing on the counter, trying to reach a bag of chips on top of the fridge. I told him to be careful and that I could get the chips for him, but he simply replied, "Oh, my friend will get it." I didn't think much of it and turned my attention back to the task at hand. Suddenly, the bag of chips exploded, spilling across the floor. I spun around, thinking the boy had climbed back onto the counter. But when I looked, he was on the floor, picking up the scattered chips. He gave me a strange look, as though it was nothing out of the ordinary, and said, "My friend accidentally knocked them off." Confused, I asked him where his friend was now. The boy pointed to the top of the fridge and said, "He's right up there, smiling at you." A cold shiver ran down my spine. I froze for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned slowly, scanning the top of the fridge, but saw nothing. The air seemed to grow colder, and my skin prickled with an unsettling sense of being watched. I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something was there, just beyond my sight, lurking in the shadows. I've never had such a chill in my life, and I'll never forget that moment. The boy's friend, whoever or whatever it was, had been watching me. And for the first time in a long while, I truly felt like I was not alone.
Story 5. The Shaking Room.
This may be a little late, but the reason I believe in the supernatural is because of a traumatic experience I had as a child. It was Easter Sunday, and my parents had set up an Easter egg hunt in the house for my brother and me. The eggs were hidden all over the house, and my parents had placed $1 coins in each of them, even in their bedroom, our bedrooms, bathrooms, and more. My parents gave us a timer saying that anything we didn't find after 30 minutes, they would take back. My brother and I decided that, when the timer started, we would run to their bedroom because it was the furthest room from us, and we would work our way back. So when the timer started, we ran to their bedroom and into the bathroom. We searched the shower, under the sink, and more. I then closed the door because there was a shelf that was hidden behind it when the door was shut. There was an egg there, so we grabbed it, but the door locked behind us. My brother and I immediately panicked, trying to open the door, banging on it, and yelling that our parents were cheating and had done it on purpose. We were just playing around and everything was still fun at that point. Then the room started shaking. I immediately got really scared. I was only 8 or 9 at the time, and my brother was about 5 or 6. He was confused as to why it was shaking. The blinds in the bathroom were rattling, and the windows started flashing with very bright lights from outside. I thought we were going to die. I started screaming and crying immediately, banging on the door for real now. After about 10 seconds, my thoughts shifted to trying to keep my brother safe. I opened the cabinet door and tried to shove him inside because I remembered my teacher telling us to find something to protect our heads in the event of an earthquake. There was a very loud noise coming from outside, like a lot of wind and a deep, terrifying noise, as if something was heading straight toward us. My brother was too big to fit fully into the cabinet, but I sat down against it to try and hold the door shut, covering my head and closing my eyes, convinced we were going to die. Then the bathroom door opened and everything stopped. When I opened my eyes, my mom looked very confused. I immediately jumped into her arms, crying and shouting that it was an earthquake, because that was the only explanation I had. My brother was stuck in the cabinet, and she immediately freaked out, calling for my dad, who ran upstairs. My mom sat me on my bed and helped my brother out, who was also crying and scared. I told her what happened. She probably would have thought I was imagining things, but my brother confirmed the lights, the shaking, and the terrifying noise. They had no explanation for it. My parents said they hadn't heard us or any noises, and they only came upstairs because there were about 5 minutes left on the timer. They thought something was wrong because we were still upstairs looking for eggs, or they were going to give us a hint to go downstairs. About a week later, I told my neighbor about it. He was one of my favorite people because he was really funny and let us ride our bikes up his big driveway. When I told him, he immediately looked freaked out. He said that a long time ago, probably about 10 years ago, there had been a serious plane crash in the neighborhood. I rode my bike back home and told my mom. She freaked out too and looked it up, and it was true. Since then, I've believed in the supernatural.
Story 6. Footsteps approaching.
I was sitting on the couch downstairs when I suddenly heard the unmistakable sound of someone walking loudly up the stairs. The problem: the stairs were on the other side of the room from where I was hearing the sound. It was so clear and vivid, like someone was stomping up them with purpose. Curious and a little unnerved, I went upstairs to check it out. At 21 years old, I was so freaked out by the noise that I ended up sleeping on my parents' bedroom floor that night. It felt like the safest place, and I couldn't shake the chill of fear that ran through me. The next morning, my mom found me in their room and asked why I was sleeping there. I explained that I had heard loud stomping up the stairs, but there were no stairs there anymore. She froze, her mouth slightly open in shock. The house had been partially gutted and renovated in 1989, 10 years before we moved in. The stairs used to be exactly where I had heard the stomping. I didn't believe her at first, but we went upstairs together. Sure enough, there was an indent in the ceiling exactly where the wall that had once separated the room from the stairs would have been. I couldn't believe it. I never thought I'd experience anything like this. If I hadn't learned about the house's remodel, I would have brushed it off as me just being a bit off, hearing things. But the coincidence of the sound matching the old stair location was too much to ignore. I still don't know what to make of it. Was it my mind playing tricks, or was there something more sinister at play?
Story 7. Shadow people.
I remember when I was 9 years old, I used to hang up these simple paper chains in my room. I would just tape pieces of paper on the wall as decorations. Anyway, one day I was playing in the room and looked ahead at my shadow, just staring at it. For some reason. For some odd reason, it seemed a little off. Then, to my horror, the shadow seemed to stretch up, or maybe it stood up. It's hard to describe, but it felt unnatural. A hand reached up from the shadow and knocked one of the pieces of paper off the wall. The paper had been taped there pretty securely. I remember freaking out and running straight to my grandma's room. Over time, I managed to get over the fear, but then 8 years later, I told my dad this story, thinking it would make him laugh. But his response was chilling. "Oh yeah, you mean shadow people?" "Yeah, our family always sees them, especially the oldest in each family. I've seen them, my dad has seen them, my mum has seen them, and her mum too. By the way, my dad and his siblings are the oldest in their family, just like I am." I was scared, of course, but I thought maybe he was just messing with me. So I decided to call my grandpa and grandma about shadow people, and within 10 minutes, they told me their own stories about being followed by them and some much scarier experiences than I had ever encountered. It honestly freaked me out, and since then I try my best not to look directly at my shadow. Also, my grandma has a lot of shadow people stories, but she refuses to tell me because, as she says, I'm very sensitive and wouldn't be able to handle it. And honestly, she's not wrong.
Story 8. The ghost I hit on a dark road.
I thought that I struck and killed a girl that wasn't there. I was driving home late at night from a double shift, so admittedly I was tired. I had my radio blaring to keep myself awake as I was driving through the backwoods on a road that I had learned to take as a shortcut. During the day, the road was busy and congested, but at night, it was always empty except for a stray deer or raccoon. I was driving, listening to music, and admittedly speeding. I took a corner too quickly and suddenly, right in front of me was a young girl, about 19 or 20, with long dark hair, wearing jeans and a light-colored blouse. For a split second, I saw her eyes reflected in the headlights, and I saw the look of shock and fear on her face. In a panic, I swerved hard off the road and into a ditch. There was no way that I didn't hit her. I jumped out of the car and started walking back to the spot where I had last seen her. I flagged down a passing car and asked them to call 911. This was before everyone had cell phones. Police officers and emergency medical technicians, EMTs, arrived, but there was no one. No body, no girl. They gave me a sobriety test on the spot. I got home much later than I should have, and my wife was waiting for me since I hadn't arrived on time. Shaken and still seeing the girl's face in my mind, I recounted the story to my wife. She went pale. She ran upstairs, grabbed a yearbook, and told me to flip through the senior pictures. On page 3, there she was, looking exactly as I had seen and described her. I asked my wife if she knew the girl, or if she had her or her family's contact information. That's when my wife told me that the girl had died 3 years earlier during a hit and run accident around that exact curve. I wasn't from the area, and there were no ghost stories involving that road. I had no way of knowing that the girl I picked out from the senior yearbook had already passed away. To this day, I still wonder what happened. Was I just tired? Had I heard her name or seen her face on a memorial newscast or clipping and not realized it? Or had I actually encountered what I still consider to be the most terrifying event in my life? I truly believed I was going to jail. I'm not entirely sure, but I can still see her face lit up by my headlights, clear as day.
Story 9. Visit from the grave.
I am a pharmacist. One day while working, I waited on one of my regular customers. He was about 80 years old, and relatively healthy for his age. He came in routinely to pick up his lisinopril hydrochlorothiazide, a medication used to treat high blood pressure, and atorvastatin, a medication used to lower cholesterol. Usually he didn't have the best attitude towards any of the staff. This day was unlike any other. We started chatting when he had come in to pick up his medications, and he mentioned that he'd be moving soon, away from the area. He reiterated many times that he had no idea where he'd be going, but that he wouldn't be here in our town anymore. He kept thanking us for all that we had done for him over the years, and he even apologized for giving us a hard time. About 3 weeks later, I received a fax from an accounting office requesting this patient's records regarding the total dollars spent on medication. This is fairly common, as in many cases that amount is tax deductible. The thing that struck me as odd was that the request was made on behalf of a trust. While this isn't completely uncommon, it was still a bit unusual. I called the accounting office to discuss the request, only to find out that the patient had died 2 months prior to his last visit to my pharmacy. My heart sank, even though our exchange during his visit had been positive. I thought that I had been confused about the dates, but I verified his signature for the prescription pickup. And sure enough, the date and time were well after his time of death. After that encounter, I felt strangely emotionally satisfied, realized that he must have come to make amends with us. We were seemingly important enough to him that he came to us to set things right.
Story 10. Moving chair.
So I worked as a carer in the United Kingdom, in Sheffield. At this point, I had been working in care for over a year, so I was pretty well trained and used to the work. In a care job, you see people die or people who have already passed, and as a carer, you're often the first person to know. So death wasn't something I was particularly scared of, as it's a natural part of life. Our company started a new care package for a lady. We were a big company at the time, so we had many carers and many clients, which, sadly, meant the same carers didn't necessarily see the same clients day in and day out. But with new management, they were trying to improve this and create more consistency in care. I'd only ever been to this lady's house a couple of times a week, usually in the mornings or at lunchtime. But I was rostered for the whole week, covering all 4 visits: morning, lunch, tea and bed. The morning visit went well. Everything was fine. Her house was lovely, albeit a bit too big for her, as she lived in the living room and kitchen. Her bed was downstairs, and there was a commode, which we emptied upstairs in one of the bathrooms. A routine bed call usually consisted of washing, using the commode, having a cup of tea, getting into her nightgown, and getting her into bed. After everything was done, we made sure to empty the commode upstairs. So I went through the living room, and opposite was a basement under the stairs. The first thing I noticed was that the basement door was unlocked and slightly open. Now, I wouldn't have thought much of it, but this lady lived alone, couldn't walk without help, and had no family to visit her. All of her friends were sadly deceased. I was the only person she had seen all day, as I had been on her schedule the whole day. I shut the basement door and locked it with a bolt, then continued through the hall to go upstairs. It was pitch black because it was winter, and it was already dark at 6 p.m. I switched the lights on as I went. I stopped at the first step and looked to the top, and something felt off. I began to feel a pricking in the air, almost like static, and a sense of impending doom filled my stomach. I had to go up because this commode needed emptying, so I quickly ran up the stairs, trying not to spill the commode, and headed straight to the end of the hall, where the bathroom was. I emptied the commode, turned the light off, and shut the door. As soon as I shut the door, I heard a thud almost like a body falling. Thinking the worst, I rushed downstairs to check if the lady had fallen out of bed. She hadn't, but I noticed that her armchair had moved closer to the bed, almost blocking the door to the kitchen. Now, I was 100% certain I had locked that door when I came in, as I always do to ensure no one can come in. I moved the chair back to where it was, and it felt almost like something was resisting me. It was unusually difficult to move, but that had never been the case before. The lady then turned to me and said, "Oh no, dear, you can leave it there. Harold likes to sit there." I just stopped, not sure if I had heard her correctly. I knew her husband had been called Harold, so I left the chair where she said and made my way out of the house as quickly as I could. When I locked the door, I distinctly heard a male voice and the lady laughing. I never went back to that house again.
Thanks for joining us on this terrifying adventure. If tonight's story gave you chills, let us know in the comments below and share your own scary experiences too. Don't forget to leave a like if you want more nightmares and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, sleep tight and remember, not all shadows are empty.